There is a village in the foothills of Maharashtra, in the western Ghats of India, where the leopard that lives in the sugarcane fields behind the last row of houses has a name. The villagers gave it the name. They have been watching it for 3 years. They know its patterns. They know which field it rests in during the hottest part of the afternoon. They know it takes the path along the irrigation channel at dusk, and they time their evening routines loosely around this knowledge, the way people time routines around predictable weather. The children have been told not to walk that path after dark. The goats are locked away by 5 in the evening. The name is spoken with something that sits between familiarity and wariness, the same emotional register that people in agricultural communities everywhere have historically reserved for things that are powerful and close and not entirely understood. The wildlife biologist who documented this situation and the dozens of villages like it across the Leopards Range in peninsular India noted something in her field records that she described as the most consequential and least discussed feature of leopard ecology in human-dominated landscapes. The leopard was not behaving like a leopard that lived in the forest. It was not cryptic in the way that wild-conditioned leopards in remote terrain are cryptic. It had not vanished when the village expanded toward its historical range boundary. It had stayed. It had watched. And over 3 years of watching and staying, it had developed a behavioral repertoire that its forest-dwelling counterparts simply did not have, a set of learned responses to human proximity, human schedule, human predictability that allowed it to live within a few hundred meters of several thousand people with a level of functional comfort that the scientific literature on leopard behavior had not, until recently, taken seriously as a research subject in its own right. What the leopard was doing, what leopards across a wide belt of human-modified landscape from sub-Saharan Africa through the Indian subcontinent are doing with increasing regularity and decreasing concealment is the subject of this script, not the leopard as a conservation statistic. Not the leopard as a symbol, the leopard as a cognitive and behavioral system that is changing, measurably and documentably, in response to repeated, sustained, consequence-free contact with the most numerically dominant large mammal on the planet. What repeated human encounters do to a predator, what they have already done, and what the trajectory of that process implies for both the predator and the people who live inside its territory. If you find this kind of material as compelling as we do, consider subscribing before we continue. What follows is long and detailed because the subject demands it. The baseline from which all of this departs is important to establish clearly because it is genuinely remarkable. The leopard, Panthera pardus, is one of the most widely distributed large carnivores that has ever lived. Its historical range extended from the Korean peninsula across Central Asia, through the Indian subcontinent, across the Middle East, through most of Africa, from the Mediterranean coast to the Cape of Good Hope. It persisted in this enormous range, not because it occupied a single ecological niche with a single set of behavioral strategies, but because it was extraordinarily flexible, a generalist within the predator guild, capable of taking prey ranging in size from dung beetles to adult female eland, capable of living in environments ranging from semi-arid scrub to rainforest to montane habitat above 4,000 meters, capable of coexisting with other large predators by being secretive, nocturnal, arboreal, and adaptable in ways that lions and tigers, with their more constrained behavioral repertoires, simply are not. This flexibility is the foundation of the leopard's story in the human-modified world. Every other large felid on the planet has lost significant portions of its historical range as human land use has intensified and expanded. The tiger has been pushed into fragmented pockets of forest that represent a small fraction of its historical distribution. The lion has retreated from virtually the entire northern half of Africa and from Asia, except for a single remnant population in the Gur forest. The cheetah exists in a distribution so compressed and fragmented relative to its historical range that population viability analyses generate uncomfortable numbers. The snow leopard's high-altitude refuge has insulated it from some of the pressures its lowland relatives face, but not from all of them. And then there is the leopard, which has lost significant range, but which remains, relative to every other large felid, stubbornly and improbably present in landscapes that wildlife biologists 2 decades ago would have written off as functionally unsuitable for apex predators. Agricultural land, peri-urban fringe, degraded forest, sugarcane plantations, coffee estates, teak monocultures, places where the habitat looks nothing like what large predator conservation frameworks consider viable, but where the leopard has found a way to persist anyway. The mechanism of that persistence is the behavioral flexibility that evolution built into the species over millions of years, and that individual leopards refine and extend through learning across their lifetimes. And it is in that individual learning, the lifetime accumulation of experience with a specific environment and its specific challenges, that the process this script is about begins. A leopard encounters a human being for the first time, or at least for the first time as a concept rather than a sensory impression, absorbed from a mother who herself had a specific and learned relationship to human presence. The encounter produces a fear response. This is the evolutionarily appropriate response for a large predator encountering a novel stimulus that its sensory and cognitive systems cannot immediately categorize as safe or manageable. The fear response has a specific physiological signature: elevated cortisol, elevated heart rate, the redirection of blood flow toward musculature at the expense of digestive function, the heightening of perceptual sensitivity across all sense modalities. It motivates a specific behavior, which is withdrawal. The leopard moves away from the human. It increases the distance between itself and this ambiguous, upright, noisy, chemically complex thing that does not fit cleanly into any of the categories its developing prey and threat recognition systems have assembled. Nothing happens as a consequence of that withdrawal. The human, who may or may not have been aware of the leopard's presence, continues doing whatever human beings do in that landscape: farming, or walking, or collecting firewood, or tending livestock. The leopard watches from a distance. Time passes. Nothing negative has happened. The leopard has not been chased. It has not been injured. It has not been shot at. The human stimulus was encountered. The fear response was generated. The withdrawal behavior was executed, and the outcome of that sequence was neutral. Not positive, not negative. Neutral. This neutral outcome is the beginning of the habituation process. The next encounter is slightly less fear-inducing than the first, because the neural pathway that links human stimulus to fear response has been updated by the experience of the previous encounter, in which human stimulus, followed by withdrawal, produced a neutral outcome. The withdrawal distance, the threshold at which the leopard considers itself far enough from a human to resume normal behavior, is slightly shorter, not by much, but by a measurable amount, by a threshold that, if you could measure it precisely, would be detectably smaller than it was before. This process repeats. It repeats dozens of times, then hundreds, then thousands. Each individual encounter updates the neural calculus slightly. Each neutral outcome chips away slightly at the magnitude of the fear response and shrinks the withdrawal distance slightly further. Over months and years of living in a landscape where human encounters are frequent and consistently consequence-free, the leopard's behavioral relationship to human beings undergoes a transformation that is not metaphorical or approximate, but literal and measurable. Its flush distance, the distance at which it detects a human and initiates withdrawal, shrinks. Its alert distance, the distance at which it first shows behavioral signs of noticing human presence, shrinks. Its tolerance zone, the area immediately around a human within which the leopard is willing to remain without withdrawing, grows. And the animal that began its life with the evolutionarily appropriate fear response of a naive large predator encountering a novel superpredator becomes something genuinely different. Not tame, not domesticated, not friendly in any sense that the word carries in ordinary usage, but functionally comfortable with human presence at ranges and in contexts that would have been impossible for it at the beginning of the process. The documentation of this process in wild leopards is now extensive enough to support conclusions that would have seemed speculative 15 years ago. Researchers working in the Western Ghats of India, in the agricultural landscapes of the Deccan Plateau, in the mixed-use landscapes surrounding India's many wildlife reserves, have accumulated GPS tracking data, camera trap records, direct observational data, and conflict incident records that together paint a picture of a species in the process of behavioral reorganization on a scale that has no precedent in the documented history of large felid biology. The data from the Junar division of Maharashtra is particularly instructive because it has been collected continuously for long enough to show the process across time, rather than just at a snapshot. Junar is a landscape of roughly 2,000 square kilometers that supports what researchers estimate is one of the highest densities of leopards in human-modified landscape anywhere in the world, somewhere between 3 and 5 animals per 100 square kilometers in the densest parts of the range. It also supports a human population of several 100,000 people, distributed across hundreds of villages and engaged primarily in sugarcane cultivation, a land use that creates, inadvertently, excellent leopard habitat in the form of dense vegetative cover that provides the concealment the species requires for resting and hunting. The interaction between these two populations, leopards and humans, across this landscape over the past 2 decades has produced a dataset that researchers describe as uniquely comprehensive and uniquely disturbing in its implications. In Junar, leopards have not just habituated to general human presence. They have habituated to specific aspects of human behavior, specific schedules, specific activities, specific contexts, in ways that reveal the sophistication of the cognitive process underlying habituation. Camera trap data shows individual leopards adjusting their activity patterns to avoid peak human activity periods in a way that maintains proximity to human settlement while minimizing direct encounters with humans during those periods. The same animals that avoid the main village paths during daylight hours move through those same paths routinely during the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning, when human foot traffic is minimal. They are not simply tolerating human landscape features. They are learning the temporal patterns of human behavior and incorporating those patterns into their movement ecology with a specificity that implies individual learning rather than innate behavioral flexibility. This temporal learning is one of the most significant findings in recent leopard research, and it matters because of what it implies about the depth of the behavioral change occurring. A leopard that has learned the specific schedule of a specific village has not simply had its fear response habituated down to a lower level. It has built a cognitive model of human behavior and incorporated that model into its daily activity budget. It is doing something closer to what we would call planning, in the sense that its current behavior reflects an anticipation of future human presence or absence based on learned patterns, rather than simply reacting to the immediate sensory presence or absence of a human being. The distinction between reactive habituation and this kind of predictive behavioral adjustment is the distinction between a simple neurological recalibration and a more complex cognitive reorganization. The leopard is not just less afraid. It is smarter about humans, in the narrow but functionally important sense that it has built a more accurate and more useful internal model of what humans do and when they do it. The prey selection data from these human-adjacent leopard populations adds another dimension to the picture. In natural prey-rich environments, leopards take a diet dominated by medium-sized ungulates, primarily the chital, sambar, and barking deer of the Indian forest. In the agricultural landscapes of Maharashtra, those prey species are present in reduced numbers. The leopard's dietary flexibility, the same flexibility that allows it to survive in such a wide range of habitats, expresses itself here in a shift toward available prey. Domestic dogs are taken at rates that in some areas constitute a majority of the documented kill record. Livestock, particularly young goats and sheep, are taken regularly. Calves are taken occasionally. And in a subset of cases that represents the most alarming data point in the entire literature on human-adjacent leopards, humans themselves, specifically the most vulnerable humans, very young children, and elderly individuals, have been killed. The attack data from Junar and surrounding divisions in Maharashtra represents the most concentrated record of leopard attacks on humans in the contemporary scientific literature. Between 2001 and 2018, wildlife authorities in the division recorded over 300 leopard attacks on humans, resulting in dozens of deaths. The majority of victims were children under the age of 10, most of them taken in or near their homes, often within earshot of other family members, sometimes from within the home itself. The attacks occurred primarily at night, but also in the hours around dawn and dusk, and in some documented cases, in full daylight. The animals involved were not, in most documented cases, showing signs of nutritional distress or injury that would have compelled prey switching under normal circumstances. They were accessing the most readily available and least defended prey in their territory, small children who were sleeping, or playing outside in the evening, or being carried by adults whose attention was elsewhere. The question of what produced this attack pattern has been examined by researchers who have been careful to distinguish between the specific conditions of the Junar situation and the general condition of human-adjacent leopards across the species range. The Junar situation is not typical of human-leopard coexistence in most parts of India or Africa. It represents one end of a gradient, the point at which habituation has progressed furthest and where the specific combination of factors that produce predatory attacks on humans has been assembled most completely. But the factors themselves are not unique to Junar. They are present at various stages of assembly in human-leopard interface zones across a wide geography. Understanding what those factors are and how they interact is the central analytical task of leopard-human conflict research. The first and most fundamental factor is the habituation itself. A leopard that has not been habituated to human presence does not attack humans for the same reason that a wild mountain lion in remote terrain almost never attacks adult humans. The behavioral signals that humans produce, the upright posture, the direct gaze, the unpredictable movement, the complex olfactory signature, do not match the prey template that the predator's nervous system has built from experience, hunting ungulates and smaller prey. The naive predator's response to a human at close range is not predatory. It is the avoidance response associated with encountering a potentially threatening novel stimulus. The human is categorized, implicitly and automatically, as something to be treated with caution rather than as food. This categorization is not fixed. It is not a species-level behavioral absolute. It is a learned assessment that can be updated by experience, and the experience of close, repeated, consequence-free contact with humans is precisely the experience that updates it in the most dangerous direction. The second factor is the availability and vulnerability profile of human prey, specifically the smallest and least capable members of human communities. The leopard's natural prey selection, the preference for juvenile ungulates, for prey that is smaller and weaker than the healthiest members of the target species, is a caloric optimization strategy built by evolution. It minimizes injury risk per successful kill and maximizes energy return relative to energy expenditure. Human children, particularly very young children, fit this prey selection template in a way that adult humans do not. They are small. They are slow. They produce sounds that in any prey species would indicate distress or vulnerability. They do not execute the confrontational behavioral responses that adult humans use to deter predatory approach. They cannot fight back effectively. A leopard that has reached a sufficient level of habituation to treat human beings as a category that it will approach closely rather than avoid at distance has arrived at a point where a very young child, encountered in the right context, at the right time, begins to pattern match against the prey template in its nervous system with a specificity that the same encounter with an adult human would not produce. The third factor is the specific habitat context of human-adjacent leopard populations. Dense sugarcane, tall grass, drainage channels, thickly planted garden and orchard land. All of these landscape features serve the same function for a hunting leopard as dense forest understory. They provide the concealment platform from which the species' ambush hunting strategy operates. A leopard that has moved into agricultural or peri-urban terrain has not left its natural behavioral mode behind. It has brought the same hunting strategy into a new landscape and applied it to new prey in new contexts. The concealment available in the human-modified landscape is often better than what is available in degraded or fragmented natural forest, because agricultural and horticultural plantings are denser at ground level than many forest types, and are managed in ways that inadvertently maximize the lateral concealment that a sit-and-wait ambush predator requires. The hunting conditions available to a habituated leopard in a sugarcane-growing landscape are, in purely physical terms, excellent. The prey density, if you include domestic animals and the incautious movements of human beings at dusk and dawn, is high. The hunting conditions are excellent and the prey is abundant. What was missing in the early stages of the habituation process was the behavioral permission to utilize them fully. The habituation process supplies that permission incrementally over months and years, until the behavioral constraints that prevented predation on human prey have been worn down to a threshold that specific encounters can cross. The pattern of attacks in the documented record reflects this threshold crossing in ways that are both analytically clear and individually devastating. The first attack in a sequence involving a specific individual animal is almost always on a small child or an elderly person, often in circumstances of particular vulnerability. A child sleeping outside in warm weather, an elderly person moving slowly in poor light, a child playing at the edge of a field at dusk without adult supervision. The attack is typically swift and fatal. Unlike lion attacks, which may begin with a charge from distance and involve a struggle, leopard attacks on small children are often concluded before anyone nearby realizes what is happening. The leopard's hunting method, the explosive ambush from concealment, the bite to the neck that severs the spinal cord or compresses the carotid arteries, is optimized for exactly this kind of rapid, close-range predation. It does not require the extended stalk and chase sequence that ungulate predation involves. The prey is already within range. The cover is already in place. The moment of decision is the only thing that separates the encounter from the outcome. And the moment of decision, for a sufficiently habituated animal in a sufficiently specific context, is a moment that the habituation process has been preparing for across years of incremental behavioral adjustment. The aftermath of these attacks at the community level is a social and psychological event that is not adequately captured by the conflict incident records that wildlife researchers compile. A village in which a child has been taken from its home by a leopard is not simply a data point in an attack frequency dataset. It is a community that has experienced something that sits at the intersection of grief and terror, and something that does not have a clean name in any language I know. The specific horror of recognizing that the thing living behind your house has decided that your children are available to it. The responses are predictable. Demands for the animal's removal, reluctance to go outside after dark, anger directed at wildlife authorities who have been slow to act, and, in some communities, the direct killing of leopards by local people acting outside the formal wildlife management system, using poison, snares, or collective mob action when an animal is cornered or identified. These community responses are not irrational. They are the responses of people who are living with a risk that is not distributed across a statistical population in a way that makes individual probability calculations meaningful at the level of a single family's daily decisions. The individual probability of a child being taken by a leopard in any given night, even in the high-attack areas of Junar, is very low. The probability that a child will be taken if the leopard continues to live and hunt in the immediate vicinity of the village is not distributed across a large population of unlikely outcomes. It is concentrated in time and space in a way that makes individual communities feel, accurately, that they are bearing a specific and unshared risk that the statistical framing of wildlife managers does not capture. The wildlife management response to these situations has been, historically, to remove the specific individual animal identified as responsible for attacks on humans. Removal, in the Indian context, means capture and translocation, or, in cases where translocation is not operationally feasible or where the animal is deemed irremediably dangerous, lethal control. The Forest Department of Maharashtra has conducted hundreds of operations to capture leopards from conflict areas, a logistically complex and expensive process that involves camera trap identification of the specific individual responsible, placement of cage traps in appropriate locations, and the subsequent transfer of the captured animal to one of the state's enclosed wildlife areas. The process is operationally defensible. It removes the specific individual whose behavior has escalated to the point of human predation. It does not address the habituation process in the surrounding leopard population. The next animal to develop the same behavioral profile through the same experiential process will do so in the same landscape under the same conditions. The intervention is individual, and the problem is systemic. This distinction between individual removal and systemic management is the central tension in contemporary leopard conflict management, and it is one that wildlife management institutions in India and across the species' African range have been slow to confront directly. The institutional preference for individual animal responses to conflict incidents is understandable. It is responsive. It is visible. It produces a tangible outcome, the removal of a specific animal, that can be communicated to the affected community as evidence of action. Systemic interventions, changes to land use practices, changes to livestock husbandry, community-level education and behavioral modification programs, physical infrastructure changes that reduce the concealment available to leopards in the vicinity of human habitation are slower, more expensive, require sustained institutional commitment across political cycles, and produce outcomes that are harder to attribute directly to specific interventions. They are also the interventions most likely to produce durable reductions in the conditions that generate conflict, rather than continuous cycles of individual removal that leave the structural drivers untouched. The African dimension of this problem runs parallel to the Indian one, but with specific features that reflect the different ecological and social contexts of leopard-human interaction across the continent. Sub-Saharan Africa contains the majority of the world's remaining wild leopard population and the greatest diversity of leopard habitats, ranging from the hyper-arid Namib and Kalahari, where leopard densities are low and human encounter frequency correspondingly low, to the densely human-settled agricultural regions of Ethiopia, Uganda, Kenya, and parts of West Africa, where human leopard overlap rivals or exceeds anything documented in India. The East African data, particularly from Kenya and Uganda, is especially instructive because it sits at an interesting intersection of conservation success, which has maintained or grown leopard populations in several protected area networks, and conservation failure, which has produced fragmented, isolated populations in reserves surrounded by intensifying human land use that generates consistent pressure on the interface zone between protected and human-dominated land. The Laikipia Plateau in Kenya is one of the most closely watched human-wildlife interface areas in Africa, in part because it supports exceptional carnivore diversity, in part because it has been the site of significant and growing human-wildlife conflict over the past decade, and in part because the ranching and conservation community of Laikipia has been unusually willing to support independent research on the dynamics of that conflict. The leopard data from Laikipia shows a population that is, in aggregate, more nocturnal than historical baseline data suggests it should be, a shift consistent with behaviorally mediated avoidance of human activity periods, and that has higher levels of livestock predation in areas adjacent to high human settlement density than in areas with lower human adjacency. The livestock predation finding is not surprising. The degree of temporal behavioral adjustment to human activity schedules, which is detectable in the camera trap and GPS collar data, is more significant than a simple livestock predation finding would suggest, because it reflects the same kind of active cognitive modeling of human behavior patterns that the Indian data documents. Uganda's situation adds a dimension that the Indian and Kenyan data do not capture as fully, which is the role of within-species variation in individual boldness in shaping the behavioral trajectory of habituating populations. Not all leopards habituate at the same rate or to the same degree under equivalent conditions of human encounter frequency. This is not surprising to anyone familiar with the behavioral ecology of large mammals, which consistently shows substantial individual variation in boldness, neophilia, and response to novel stimuli both within and between populations. What the Ugandan data suggests is that the leopard populations experiencing the most intensive human contact over the longest periods are not just habituating at the population level, but are, in some areas, showing evidence of directional selection for reduced fear of humans. The boldest individuals, those with naturally lower fear responses and therefore lower flush distances even before habituation begins, are the ones most likely to successfully exploit human-modified landscapes. They access more food in the form of livestock and human-adjacent prey. They hold territories that overlap more heavily with human settlement. They are more likely to survive the early period of exposure to human-dominated terrain, which carries risks for naive animals that the bolder individuals navigate more successfully. They are also, potentially, passing the neurobiological substrate of their boldness to offspring. The selection pressure here is not strong. The effect, if it exists, would accumulate over many generations, but the direction of the pressure is toward leopard populations that are behaviorally closer to the human-tolerant end of the distribution than their ancestors were. Not because individual habituation has made them more tolerant, but because the landscape rewards individuals who are constitutionally more tolerant, and those individuals are contributing disproportionately to the next generation. This potential evolutionary dimension of the habituation story is the most speculative and the most consequential implication of the current trajectory. Individual habituation is reversible in principle. An animal whose flush distance has been reduced through repeated neutral encounters can, in principle, be subjected to aversive conditioning, to encounters with humans that carry negative consequences, chasing, non-lethal deterrents, hazing, that reintroduce the fear component the habituation process has removed. The reversibility of individual habituation through aversive conditioning is documented in other large predator species, particularly bears, and is the basis for coexistence management programs that use hazing and aversive conditioning as alternatives to lethal removal. The evolutionary selection for constitutionally bolder individuals is not reversible on any management-relevant timescale. If the populations experiencing the most intense human-adjacent selection pressure are producing, generation by generation, individuals whose baseline fear responses are somewhat lower than their ancestors, the behavioral challenge of coexistence management is not static. It is getting harder. The behavioral space within which coexistence is possible is being compressed from both sides simultaneously, by human expansion into leopard habitat on one side and by the directional behavioral change in the leopard population on the other. The conflict over management philosophy in India has a specific and uncomfortable political dimension that is worth examining because it has directly shaped the outcomes on the ground in ways that the purely biological analysis does not capture. India's Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 established a legal framework for wildlife conservation that was among the most stringent in the world at the time of its passage, and that reflected a genuine and important national commitment to the protection of the country's extraordinary biological heritage. The leopard is a Schedule I species under the Act, meaning it carries the highest level of legal protection available. Killing a leopard, outside the specific circumstances authorized under Section 11 of the Act, is a serious criminal offense. This legal status is not in question, and the reasoning behind it is sound. The leopard has lost significant range and population across South and Southeast Asia, and the legal protection has been a meaningful contributing factor to its persistence in India in densities that would have been impossible without that protection. But the legal and institutional framework built around this protection has created, in the areas of densest human-leopard overlap, a specific and damaging dynamic. Communities experiencing high rates of leopard attack on children and livestock have found themselves unable to take direct protective action without legal risk. The institutional response to attack incidents, centered on capture operations conducted by Forest Department personnel, has been chronically slow relative to the pace at which attacks occur in high-conflict areas. The perception, accurate in many documented cases, that the legal system protects the leopard more effectively than it protects the rural poor who live alongside it, has generated a resentment toward conservation institutions and toward the leopard itself that does not create favorable conditions for the long-term coexistence that both parties require. The community members who lose children to leopard attacks and who find that the institutional response is a capture operation that takes months to complete, during which additional attacks occur, are not being unreasonable when they express anger. They are expressing the legitimate grievance of people who have been asked to bear a cost in the form of asymmetric exposure to predation risk that is not distributed fairly across the society that benefits from the conservation outcome the sacrifice sustains. This is the coexistence dilemma at its starkest. The leopard's persistence in human-dominated landscapes is, from a conservation biology perspective, one of the genuinely positive stories in the otherwise grim narrative of large carnivore decline. The species is doing something that tigers, lions, and cheetahs cannot do. It is surviving in the interstices of the human world. It is maintaining population densities in agricultural landscapes that would be unrecognizable as wildlife habitat to any conservation framework built around protected areas and species viability thresholds. This is an extraordinary achievement of evolutionary and behavioral flexibility, and it matters enormously to the global conservation picture. But the costs of that achievement are not being borne by the global conservation community. They are being borne by the rural communities in Maharashtra, in Uganda, in Ethiopia, in the Western Cape of South Africa, in dozens of other places where the leopard's adaptability has allowed it to persist in the most human-modified of landscapes. The gap between who benefits from the leopard's conservation success and who bears the risk of its behavioral adaptation to human proximity is the most pressing equity problem in large carnivore conservation, and it is not being addressed with anything approaching the seriousness it requires. The camera trap data that has driven so much of the recent insight into leopard behavior near human settlements has also produced something that researchers did not initially set out to document, but that has become impossible to ignore in the data. The data shows individual leopards, identified by spot pattern across hundreds of camera trap events over years of monitoring, developing what can only be described as site-specific behavioral strategies that are more sophisticated than simple habituation would predict. One male in the Maharashtra data, identified across several years of camera trap records and given a research designation that the field team used consistently, demonstrated a specific and repeatedly documented behavior of investigating livestock enclosures in a specific village on the same nights each week, specifically the nights following the days when the livestock were driven to distant grazing grounds. The enclosures were full of young animals on those nights, because the herd had not yet been dispersed for the morning. The male appeared to have learned the schedule. He did not visit the enclosures on nights when the cattle were out on night grazing. He visited on the nights when they were in. This is not simple habituation. This is not a reduced fear response to a familiar stimulus. This is the application of learned information about a specific human practice to optimize the individual's foraging strategy. It is a level of cognitive engagement with the human social and economic environment that has significant implications for how we think about the trajectory of leopard behavior in human-adjacent landscapes. If individual leopards can learn the schedules of specific villages, the specific patterns of specific human activities, and adjust their behavior accordingly, then the habituation story is not primarily a story about fear reduction. It is a story about cognitive engagement with a novel and complex environmental variable, the human presence and the human social economic system, that the animal's nervous system is processing with a sophistication that the fear habituation framework does not fully capture. The leopard is not just becoming less afraid of humans, it is becoming more knowledgeable about them. It is building a richer, more specific, more useful internal model of what humans do and when and why. And the more accurate and more detailed that internal model becomes, the more effectively the animal can exploit the resources that human activity makes available, and the more precisely it can navigate the behavioral constraints that human presence imposes. A more knowledgeable leopard is not automatically a more dangerous leopard, but it is an animal whose relationship to human beings has become more complex, more multidimensional, and in some circumstances more difficult to manage using the behavioral tools that worked on naive, fear-responsive animals. The aversive conditioning programs that wildlife managers have deployed in some conflict areas represent an attempt to use the same learning capacity against itself. If the leopard learns from positive experiences, from encounters with humans that yield no negative consequence, that humans are safe to approach, then it should in principle also learn from negative experiences, from encounters with humans that yield aversive consequences, that humans carry a risk worth avoiding. The hazing programs used for bears in North America, for elephants in parts of Africa, and experimentally for leopards in a small number of Indian conflict areas operate on this principle. They use non-lethal deterrents, rubber projectiles, crackers, dogs, bright lights, to deliver aversive consequences to individual animals detected in proximity to human settlement or livestock. The goal is not to create intense or traumatic fear, but to restore a functional avoidance response, a flush distance that keeps the animal outside the range at which predatory encounters can occur. The published results of these programs in leopard conflict areas are mixed in a way that reflects the cognitive sophistication argument. In some cases, particularly with relatively young animals whose habituation process is not yet far advanced, aversive conditioning appears to work as expected. The animal's flush distance increases. Its use of human-adjacent areas decreases. The conflict incident rate associated with that specific individual declines. In other cases, particularly with older animals whose habituation has proceeded further and whose internal model of human behavior is more detailed, the aversive conditioning appears to produce something more complex than simple fear restoration. Animals have been documented that respond to the specific hazing stimuli used in a conditioning program while continuing to exploit the same resources at the same proximity when those specific stimuli are absent. They have learned to avoid the specific negative consequence, the rubber projectile, the cracker, the light, without generalizing that avoidance to human presence more broadly. They have, in other words, incorporated the aversive conditioning experience into their model of human behavior as one more pattern to track and avoid, rather than updating their general assessment of human proximity in the direction the conditioning was intended to push it. The smarter the animal, the more precisely it can learn the specific conditions under which negative consequences from humans occur, and the more precisely it can adjust its behavior to exploit the gaps between those conditions. This outcome is not unique to leopards. It is documented in ravens, in crows, in some populations of coyotes, in bears that have been exposed to extensive hazing programs. It is the cognitive analog of antibiotic resistance, not the evolution of a new capability, but the application of an existing cognitive toolkit to the specific problem of an aversive conditioning program, with results that undermine the effectiveness of the intervention. The leopard is not smarter than the wildlife managers designing the conditioning program, but it is learning the specific features of its specific environment with a speed and specificity that can outpace the institutional bandwidth of management programs that are typically underfunded, understaffed, and operating at temporal scales that the individual animal's learning can run ahead of. The relationship between rural communities and the leopard populations they coexist with is not static in the way that the conflict incident data might suggest. It is not simply a one-directional process of increasing leopard boldness, driving increasing human fear, and increasing conflict. The human side of this relationship is also learning, adapting, and in some cases, developing behavioral and social strategies for living with habituated predators that are more sophisticated and more effective than the formal wildlife management system's interventions. In parts of Maharashtra, where leopard densities are highest, and where the community has been living with this reality for the longest time, traditional knowledge systems about leopard behavior, movement patterns, and the circumstances under which encounters are most likely to occur have been integrated into daily routines in ways that reduce encounter frequency and encounter risk. Children in these communities are not naive about the leopard behind the sugarcane. They know its patterns in the way that their parents and grandparents learned those patterns through long cohabitation. The timing of outdoor activity, the organization of child supervision, the management of livestock routines, all carry the imprint of generations of coexistence with a large predator in ways that formal wildlife management institutions rarely acknowledge or attempt to systematize. The knowledge embedded in these traditional practices is not scientifically derived, but it is empirically grounded in the accumulated experience of communities that have been managing the relationship for generations. And it is one of the most underutilized resources in the formal conflict management toolkit. When formal management institutions attempt to develop community-based conflict mitigation programs, the most effective of them are the ones that begin by documenting and respecting what the community already knows about the animals they live with, rather than arriving with a management prescription derived from a research program that the community had no part in designing. The communities of Maharashtra's conflict zones are not passive recipients of wildlife management. They are knowledge systems with more accumulated experience of this specific interface than any research program that has been running for a decade or two. Engaging them as partners in conflict management rather than as beneficiaries of management prescriptions is not just an equity concern. It is a practical advantage for the management system. The leopard's ability to shift prey species and to incorporate new prey categories into its hunting repertoire is one of the features that makes it uniquely capable of persisting in human-dominated landscapes, and also uniquely capable of generating the specific pattern of attacks on humans that the high conflict areas document. The shift from wild ungulates to livestock to domestic dogs to human beings is not a single step or a single decision. It is a gradient along which individual animals move at different speeds and to different degrees, depending on the specific combination of habituation depth, prey availability, individual boldness, and encounter context that characterizes their situation. Most habituated leopards never move beyond the livestock and dogs level of this gradient. The behavioral governor that suppresses predatory responses toward humans is not absolute, but it is robust. It survives significant habituation without failing in most individuals. The subset of individuals in whom it fails is small, but it is consistently produced by a consistent set of conditions, and those conditions are consistently present in the areas of deepest human-leopard overlap. The depth of behavioral change that occurs in the most habituated individuals is illustrated most starkly by the documented cases in which leopards have entered occupied human dwellings to take prey. These cases exist in the attack record from Maharashtra, from Uganda, from historical accounts of man-eating leopards in India that date to the colonial period and were documented by hunters like Jim Corbett, whose accounts, whatever their limitations as scientific literature, provide behavioral observations of extraordinary specificity. Corbett's documentation of the Panar leopard and the Rudraprayag leopard, both animals responsible for large numbers of human deaths in the early 20th century, describes behaviors that are consistent with what modern researchers document in high habituation, high predation individual animals. The willingness to enter dwellings, the boldness in the presence of fire and light and human noise, the precision and speed of the attack, the absence of the hesitation that wild conditioned animals show in human proximity. What Corbett described as the essential character of a man-eater, which he attributed partly to injury and partly to opportunity, modern behavioral ecology would redescribe as the combination of advanced habituation, prey category switching, and the specific individual temperament that allows an animal to cross the behavioral threshold between approaching humans and attacking them. The mechanism is not different from what he observed. The conceptual framework for understanding it has simply become more rigorous. The regions of Africa, where leopard density and human density overlap most intensively, Particularly the humid zones of West and Central Africa and the densely settled highlands of East Africa have received less research attention than the Indian situation and the Southern African ranching landscape, partly because of research infrastructure limitations and partly because of the complexity of documenting conflict in areas with limited formal institutional capacity. The accounts that do exist from these areas suggest patterns consistent with what the Indian data documents, but potentially more extreme in their expression, because the prey base in some of these areas is more heavily depleted by hunting pressure, making prey switching toward livestock and human prey more.